The real world doesn't operate that way, and people that operate at freakishly high levels, they still kick ass even if they're eating chicken McNuggets. So what is the deal with fruit versus starchy carbohydrates in relation to A, body composition, B, performance, output, and recovery? My rudimentary understanding is that fruit is like nature's dessert and somehow doesn't give us the performance and glycolytic energy the way yams or rice would. Is that accurate? If so, why? That's a wonderful question. This follow-up question is, if fruit does not benefit comparably for performance, then how does it benefit? In terms of body composition straight up, there's really no physiological difference. There's some practical differences I'll address, but performance in the gym, regarding weight training at least, it doesn't really take that much energy. That's a fancy way of saying, or a short way of saying, lifting weights doesn't really burn calories that many. You know, if you have like a 90-minute workout, it really is like 60 minutes of, or even more, like 70 minutes of dicking around and then 20 minutes of actual work. And so that really just doesn't burn many calories. And unless you're literally starving, you really just don't need that much energy to lift weights. And even in things like CrossFit, things like that, there's just not that much activity per unit time, you know, as compared to something like an ultra endurance athlete. So yeah, fruit has a mixture of starch and glucose and fructose and other sugars, and those will be able to fuel your training just fine. You really are an ultra endurance athlete where that sort of timing does make a difference, then it just doesn't matter. And even if you are, then your calories are so damn high that the type of calories you consume is not as big of a deal anyway. If you have to take in a couple thousand calories for the carbohydrates, as long as it is carbohydrate in there somewhere, you're gonna get the fuel you need. At that point, it's just gas in the tank, if I may say so myself. It's advisable, or be advised, that like the meal that you eat before training isn't really the calories that you use during training. It's more likely the food that you consumed in the day or days prior that's gonna be the stored energy you used during training. This is specifically true, or doubly true, or whatever, with resistance training related activities. And your pre-workout meal is more like your post-workout, especially if it's solid food. So keep that in mind. So when it comes to practicalities, it's just a matter of what your preferences are. And if you prefer eating before you train and you feel like you perform better, good, because that's what matters. If you prefer fruits and something more filling, then do that. That's something I'll address in a second. I do want to say that fruits do contain free glucose and they still contain starch. They are not pure starch, but they still contain everything you need to convert glucose to pyruvate, which is something that is used in glycolysis for energy production, and you don't need to incorporate that pesky oxidative phosphorylation for that. Fancy stuff. I just want to point out that there is a common misunderstanding about the carbohydrate distribution in fruit, mostly that a lot of people think all of the carbohydrate in fruit is fructose, which is patently false. Yes, fruit does contain fructose, but fruit is not entirely fructose. That would be super gross and would destroy your stomach every time you consumed it. The fructose content in most regularly consumed fruits is actually relatively low in comparison to the combined starch and glucose content. And from my perspective, starch and glucose are pretty much the same. Starch is just chains of glucose, so they don't taste as good because the molecules are bigger. In my opinion, the glycogen that you're using today is, like I said, from the food that you consumed the day before, and the total amount of glycogen you store at any given time probably pales in comparison to its localized depletion during resistance training. That's a fancy way of saying I have a hard time feeling, or a hard time thinking, that you deplete your entire body's supply of glycogen from a weight training workout. And if you're an endurance athlete, then a lot of that glycogen is actually coming from your liver, which can store a lot of glycogen at any given time. And so I think for most shorter distances, that is a moot point. And so long as glycogen stores are replete, then I'm not quite sure the whole food carbohydrate source makes that much of a difference. That's basically saying that if you get enough carbohydrate over the course of a period of days, and then your lifetime thereafter, your glycogen stores will fill themselves back up. There are very few people who need immediate replenishment of their glycogen stores all the time. These would probably be people who do really heavy endurance activities multiple times per day, in which case they're eating so much damn food that at that point it's just gas in the tank. So I hope that isn't too confusing for you guys. To be more concise, I'm not quite convinced the composition of your food choices matters in terms of performance for resistance training related activities, because the energy that you use during training is from the food you consumed the day before and the days prior, and very minimal amounts of glycogen sparing from your pre-workout meal. So that's just basically that. So long as you get enough calories over a period of the day, that's gonna be what is fueling your workout the next day. And after that, it basically becomes personal preference. One other thing I'd like to point out is that but I think the obsession with performance has interfered with practical nutrition on quite a few levels. And generally speaking, I care much more about a person's quality of life than I do about their performance, whatever that really means. I find that most people obsessed with performance couldn't even perform their way out of a cardboard box and are trying to somehow find the secret of eating this much potato to make the difference between a silver and a gold medal. And it's just, the real world doesn't operate that way. And people that operate at freakishly high levels, they still kick ass even if they're eating chicken McNuggets. So that's something I wanted to point out on practical terms. The reality is that fruit, especially berries, they have a high micronutrient content, a high fiber content, a high antioxidant content. They are less calorie dense and therefore more filling. You just can't lose. You can't. And speaking from experience, nobody's losing gold medals because they decided to eat banana instead of a potato. Mostly because they're the same goddamn thing, but something to keep in mind. Also, some people find things like rice boring and that's why they go for fruit, which is perfectly reasonable. You can mix them. But honestly, if you find some foods boring, then maybe you just need to get better at cooking them. Hope that was helpful. If you're picking up what I'm putting down and want to learn more about cognitive nutrition so you can finally live the life you deserve, then learn about my Kickstart program by clicking the link in the description box below.